My name is John Sullivan. I've actually been going to the country of Ukraine for over a decade. Many times people ask me, what is an Irish American with the last name of Sullivan doing going to Ukraine? What happened was, over a decade ago, I learned about the history and saw the culture of Ukraine. I learned about their love of freedom and their desire to have a better life for themselves and their children. It enthralled me. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about the history of Ukraine, and primarily about how the Russians have actually oppressed Ukraine for centuries. A lot of people don't understand. For instance, in the 5th century, Kiev was founded. At the time, there was no Moscow. A few years later, the city of Kiev Rus and the dynasty of Kiev Rus existed. Kiev Rus was developed from the Vikings. The Vikings actually would go from Viking land, go down the Dnieper River into the Black Sea for trading. That's why the word Rus is actually a Viking word for men who row. As we go forward, we find a lot happening with Kiev Rus. And nothing exists in Moscow. It doesn't exist as a real place. We go forward and we go to a time frame where Christianity is brought to that part of the world by Saint Volodymyr. Actually, the first baptism that was done in that part of the world was done by the Ukrainian, Saint Volodymyr. He is not Russian. As we keep looking at this throughout history, we see these type of things happening where the Russians will tell you it was their history, and it never was. Because when we look at this, we see Kiev Rus, which runs into the late 1100s. And the fact is, the word Russia was never even used until around 1300. The word Russia, since they came up with the brilliant way of stealing a name, is only the Greek word for Rus. So they don't even have that is common. Russia, after stealing the name, and if you talk to most Ukrainians, they will tell you that Russia is not Russia, it's Muscovy. It will never be Russia to them, because Kiev Rus is the true Russia. The Russians come in, they actually end up trying to destroy the culture for centuries. Not just recently, but actually back in the 14, 15, 16, and 1700s. They did not want the culture to exist anymore. Why? They were jealous. They have actually no culture of their own. So we keep fast forwarding. We go through centuries of Kiev Rus existing, of fantastic culture, and nothing more than Russia trying to destroy it. After Lenin starves the Ukrainians to death in 1922, he decides to let them grow again. He decides to let the Ukrainian culture expand. Then Lenin dies. When Lenin died, a gentleman by the name of Stalin came into play. He was probably the most oppressive dictator in history. What Stalin did was cause the Ukrainian culture to no longer exist. It's called Russification. It was a stance that Russia is the head of everything. The Ukrainian culture that goes back centuries is no longer allowed to be talked about. The Ukrainian language, which actually has 4 letters in our alphabet that Russians don't have, was forbidden. This continued to happen throughout history. By 1931-32, Stalin had started the collectivization of the Ukrainian farmlands. By doing that, it made people less productive. He stole the farm products, the grains, etc., from Ukraine, which is the wealthiest and richest farmland in the world. And Ukrainians starved to death. The numbers are between 6 and 8 million Ukrainians were starved, living in the most fertile land in history. The war then comes along. One of the tough parts about Ukrainian history is if you have been starved and you've lost 6 to 8 million of your people because of the atrocities from Stalin, from the USSR, and the Germans come in, who are you going to side with? They had no choice. Now, the funny thing is, the Russians, even though they bring it up all the time, The Ukrainians sided with Nazi Germany. The Russians actually sided with Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941. For some reason, they forget that. Russians always forget things. I can go through the history of World War II. It is very complicated with Ukraine. There are a lot of situations that took place. This is neither the place nor the time to actually go through that. So what I'm going to do is skip until afterwards. In 1944, the Crimean Tatars, yes, Crimea, there were 200,000 that were taken from Crimea to Uzbekistan by Stalin. Of those 200,000 people, almost one half, 3 years later, were dead. In 1946 and 47, once again, the Soviet Union starved Ukrainians, and over 1 million died. Throughout the days of Stalin, we went back and forth. One decade, we would allow Ukraine to be free. And then we would go into Russification, and you couldn't say the word Ukraine anymore. You couldn't talk about the great culture and the history of Ukraine. This happened throughout the 50s and the 60s. In the 70s, Ukraine actually had some freedom. A little, at least from Russian standards. And they were able to develop their culture again and bring out their proud history and their proud language. And then came Brezhnev. Brezhnev was like a mini Stalin. He forbid the Ukrainian people to speak their own language. The books were destroyed. The culture was destroyed. It was massive Russification. Now let's think back over the decades and the centuries. And you're a Ukrainian. The most important thing in your life is freedom. Yet what does Russia do? They deny you the ability to be free. They destroy your language. They steal your history. They steal your culture. By the time we get to Brezhnev, who again is just choking the Ukrainian people, again, the Russification, the destruction of Ukrainian culture. Once we go through that, we have an incident called Chernobyl. Many people, even today, do not realize Chernobyl is Ukraine. The Russians told them nothing about it. The Chernobyl disaster happened, and I have friends that were actually in a parade in Kyiv within 3 days of that. Little kids marching in a parade. And Russians cared so little about Ukrainians, they said nothing. By 1990s, the USSR failed, fortunately. In 1991, the Ukrainians voted for independence and actually had their first constitution after the one they issued in 1710. From that point forward, Ukraine was fighting against the Russian oppression to be free. Russia has continually been like a boyfriend that the girl doesn't want to deal with anymore, and they're a stalker. They will never let him go. That is Russia's relationship with Ukraine. Ukraine wants nothing to do with Russia. They only want to be free to have their own culture for their own kids. As we go through these times, we get to a time frame of 2010, which is very interesting from my standpoint. The president who was elected, contrary to popular belief, was a man named Yanukovych. Yanukovych was from eastern Ukraine. He had been convinced by his campaign advisor that in order to be elected, he had to be pro-EU. The man had always been pro-Russian his entire life. He runs as pro-EU, he's elected, and in 2013 flips and turns toward Russia. Contrary to the popular belief of many people, there was no coup. The Ukrainian people were fed up. They did not want to deal with Russia anymore. So they protested, and Maidan happened. And then Yanukovych crushed them. But the Ukrainians didn't quit. They kept protesting. And Yanukovych, like the coward he is, ran away to Russia. At that same time frame, in 2014, the Russians invaded. They invaded Crimea. They invaded Donbass. There was no separatist movement. There never had been. You can look in history. There was never a separatist movement. This was Russian outsiders coming in to invade. Now, the question many people have is, Russia has so much land, why would they need to invade? My speculation on that is that Russia is essentially a country of natural resources. The Donbas region of Ukraine is very rich in natural resources. Crimea, besides being a naval base, actually has a lot of offshore oil and gas wells. So we have a war that goes on. It starts in 2014. By 2015, the world's tired of it. Nobody talks about it anymore. And in the Donbas region, people are dying every day. Houses are destroyed. People are killed. I believe the numbers were 15 to 16,000 people were killed from 2014 until 2022. A gentleman by the name of Zelensky was elected. At his election, he was actually a pro-peace candidate, not pro-war. He negotiated with Russia for over 2 years, trying to end what was happening in eastern Ukraine. And then Russia did what they always did. They lied, and they invaded in February of 2022. The situation that's taking place there is much, much worse than anyone actually knows. In my trips to Ukraine, I understand this. One thing I try to tell Americans is if we can look back at a time frame called 9/11 in the US, and a lot of us that are old enough remember where we were. On 9/11, we saw planes hit the World Trade Center. We wondered what was going to happen next. The next day we were stressed. We didn't know what would happen. Where would the next strike happen? It's what Ukrainians have dealt with for over 360 days now. Every day, missiles. Is it your day? Is it going to hit you or not? And Ukrainians live through that. The atrocities that I've seen and heard of, I'll bring up. One, I can barely ever get through. The first one is about animals. Animals are very innocent. They don't know what's going on. When the invasion happened in Bucha, there was an animal shelter. There were 450 dogs there. The workers in the animal shelter left, knowing, of course, they would be able to go back and feed the dogs. 3 of them tried. They were shot and killed by the Russians. When Ukraine finally regained Bucha, they went to that animal shelter. And what they found were 450 starved, dead, and abused animals. That's the Russian culture that really exists. There's a story I was told by a soldier. No reason for him to lie. He served in many parts of the world. And he has said what he's seen in Ukraine is unlike anything he's seen anywhere. A story happened again outside of Kyiv. They were clearing an apartment, and they go into a room. It's a bedroom, and they look over in the corner, and there's a bed with a 7-year-old girl laying in it. She'd been dead. As they got closer, they found there were 17 slash marks across her body. But it was even worse than that. When they got even closer, the 7-year-old girl had been raped by Russian barbarians. Within 2 days, when the investigation concluded, they found there were 12 samples of DNA in this little girl. She was 7 years old. How do we allow this? The last story is very dear to my heart. I was born on July 15th. This happened on July 14th. A little girl who has Down syndrome was walking with her mother on her way to a speech lesson in Vinica. There's a video out there of Liza pushing her cart, and her mother says, "Liza, where are we going?" And Liza says, "We're going to see Allah." How little Liza actually knew how prophetic that was. On the way back that day, walking again through town center, Liza was struck by a Russian missile fired from 600 miles away. This little Down syndrome child who had nothing wrong, wanted nothing to hurt anyone else, is blown to bits by a Russian missile. How do we allow this to continue? It cannot continue. As I said, there's a line in the Ukrainian national anthem. We will give our bodies and soul for freedom. That's who they are. It is the most important thing in their life is to be free. They will not give up. This is not the West forcing them to fight. If Zelensky wanted to negotiate right now, there would be an uprising. Ukraine will win this with our support, and we have to give them everything we can so the little people like Eliza and the little girl they found in the bed and the dogs don't have to go through this anymore.